Have you ever wondered why Jimmy Neutron, the brainiac of the town, is awfully weird and how his parents are just as dim-witted? Today, we'll cover the series Jimmy Neutron from start to end in detail. Well, you know how people always talk about how we inherit our IQ from our folks? So here's the kicker. Jimmy's parents are pretty average in the smarts department, right? So where did he get his brain power boost from? Well, the answer is beyond simple. One of them is playing a game of pretend fool. And why do I say that? Well, ever notice how Hugh Neutron, Jimmy's dad, is just this total character? I mean, he's always pulling these weird stunts or trying to hog the limelight, right? And you know what they say about super smart folks? They sometimes act all goofy to keep their brain power under wraps. So, why does Hugh put on this act of playing the dummy? Well, first off, the guy's all grown up, and he couldn't care less about being some brainiac. He's all about the simple life, just enjoying his pie and giving his all to be the best dad he can be for Jimmy. And secondly, Hugh's not about to steal Jimmy's thunder, he's got it all figured out. If he starts showing off his smarts and outshines Jimmy, folks will start looking at him as the genius dad, and that's not what he's aiming for. I know, this all is a bland stretch without evidence, so I'm here to tell you that there's plenty. Well, you see, Mr. Hugh was the president of the Brain Teaser Club back in high school, so did he all of a sudden just lose his brains? And strangely, even though he acts goofy, he's actually a pro at handling all of Jimmy's inventions. It's like he's setting things up for Jimmy to shine and be the hero. Another damning evidence is the fact that Hugh's memory is seriously next level. He's like a pie expert, remembering all kinds of pies by heart. But funny enough, he somehow forgets about apple pie. Also, when Hugh gets his hands on Jimmy's time rewind contraption, he somehow manages to accidentally, not so accidentally, transport Jimmy way back, like 2 million years ago. Also, he can goof around with this gizmo and do a bunch of weird stuff for this whole series. And even though he's not exactly the brightest bulb in the box, somehow he totally knows how to use the time rewind thing when he's like jumping out of a plane. Doubtful, right? Like he rewinds time to the exact moment before he took the plunge so he doesn't end up as a pancake or with a bunch of broken bones. I mean, you'd think someone who's not so smart might end up accidentally offing themselves with that gadget, but no, not him. He's also always putting on this intentional dumb act. There was this one time when he showed up at Jimmy's school play and he's totally uselessly saying dumb stuff and even for no reason stupidly asking Cindy for a drink even though the whole theater is super quiet focusing on the play. I mean, how hard is it for even a fool to sit straight? And to add more fuel to the fire, there's even this episode where they make it super clear that Jimmy's got his dad's genius genes. They showed the next brainiac in the family, but this time he's a bad guy. Baby Eddie. And wait for it, there's also a strong tendency for craziness in the family tree. I mean, all those aunts were like total nutcases. Honestly, I kinda thought Hugh might have been a brainiac like Jimmy when he was young, but then he must have fried his brain in some experiment, gone totally haywire, or just ended up going bonkers. But hey, this has got to be the juiciest proof yet. And that's not all. Jimmy's mom, Judy, goes even a step ahead. Sometimes they drop hints that maybe Jimmy didn't just inherit his mega brain from his dad, but his mom's got some serious smarts too, and unlike her husband, she has no plans to remain a shut-in. Being that housewife is a genius. Like this one time, she totally geeked out and pointed out a flaw in Jimmy's supersonic running shoes, something he hadn't even thought about.
Won't the combustion cycle become increasingly irregular due to the inhibiting effect of the silicon's thermal resistance?
And remember that time she whipped out a high-tech gadget from her closet to take down the Maternatron? Oh, and let's not forget about what an absolute blast she was in that episode. I mean, when the mommy robot went cray-cray and even terrorized poor Hugh, Judy just somehow heard Hugh scream, despite the fact that she was miles away. Also, the fact that she has a tracking device in Hugh's skin is pretty genius for when you have a wonky husband. But this also makes me wonder if she has the tracker to control Hugh's hidden potential, or is she secretly just an evil controlling housewife? Either way, that's grim and borderline evil despite the fact that it's put to make sure he stays safe. And on top of all this, Judy's the family's go-to mechanic. You can catch her in the garage, tinkering with plugs and boosting the family's car's horsepower. So, no big surprise if Jimmy's mechanical wizardry comes straight from his mama. Nevertheless, both of Jimmy's parents are absolutely in love and caring towards each other. Even Hugh, who seems like an idiot, is quite committed, and you know what? Hugh had this big chance to team up with McSpankies and rake in that cash, but guess what? He went a different route and used that money to buy a shiny wedding ring for Judy, which is absolutely sweet. But you know what? Sometimes Jimmy can feel pretty insecure of his genius. Once, when he excitedly showed his parents his new invention, he just aimed to use it to make fresh orange juice. But things didn't go exactly according to plan. The invention went totally haywire and ended up creating a huge mess in the kitchen. And to add to the chaos by some weird twist of fate, everything in the kitchen somehow got launched into space. And guess what was the end result? A literal meteorite was hurtling toward Earth. Yep, this could have easily resulted in a major disaster akin to extinction. Of course, Judy wasn't exactly thrilled about the havoc, and even though Jimmy tried to make amends, Judy put her foot down and insisted that he go to school. This is where he couldn't help but think about how being super smart sometimes got him into these kinds of situations. Poor Jimmy was feeling pretty down about it all. So, he came up with a plan to create a machine called the Brain Drain 8000 to temporarily make himself less smart. Unfortunately, that plan turned out to be a bust, and he ended up with a brain that was about as clever as a monkey's. When Jimmy returned to school, it was pretty obvious that he wasn't as sharp as he used to be, especially when he stumbled over a simple maths question. But the guy literally forgot that he just set off an earth-shattering meteorite towards his home. Needless to say, everyone started panicking and rushed outside. Only the genius of Jimmy could undo such an event. But Jimmy was a Dumbo now, and despite giving it his all, his not-so-smart brain just couldn't figure it out. That's when Cindy came to the rescue and realized that Jimmy needed to get his smarts back. She convinced him to give the brain drain thing another shot, and surprisingly, it worked. And finally, the day was saved. Well, I guess we'd all want Jimmy to suffer in his genius. But that doesn't stop him from feeling lonely at times. I guess all those who have been gifted in their life can relate, but only Jimmy had the power to give himself a robot friend. You see, when Jimmy was trying to find someone to help him test out his cool new invention, he hit up Carl and Sheen, but they were tied up with other stuff. Then, while he was chilling in the park, he spotted Butch having a blast with his little bro. And that got Jimmy thinking, maybe having a little bro would cancel out his loneliness as well. So he talked to his folks, Judy and Hugh, about the whole deal, and they tried explaining that getting a little bro wasn't a walk in the park like he thought. Dude's still innocent, good to know. Nevertheless, Jimmy was like, no biggie, I'll just make my own bro. And that's when Brobot came into the picture. This robot was all sorts of special with crazy abilities. Jimmy showed Brobot to his folks, and then they hit the park to test out the gizmo. Problem was that Brobot totally outshined Jimmy in everything, even wowing his pals, and soon Cindy, Libby, Carl, and Sheen started hanging more with Brobot, leaving poor Jimmy feeling like a third wheel. As Brobot kept encroaching on Jimmy's turf, he decided to give him the old switcheroo and turn him off, only to realize that the thing was invincible. You'd think that would make Jimmy furious, but no, he was happy big time. So he went ahead and literally created Brobot's parents and introduced him to Mombot and Popbot. Luckily, they jetted off to the moon, having a blast together and hopefully leaving Jimmy's life to him for good. However, do you know that Jimmy also has an evil version? Yep, meet Evil Jimmy. He was the final one among the 6 clones that Jimmy whipped up to help with chores. Only he was like the complete opposite of Jimmy's good morals and stirred up trouble by pretending he was the real Jimmy. However, that move totally blew up in his face when Jimmy put the freeze on his clone crew. But sadly, before Jimmy could nab him, Evil Jimmy slipped away using Jimmy's jetpack. So now, good Jimmy's left dealing with a mess. Turns out, Evil Jimmy even created a super cool rocket bike. And what did he do with it? He flew around Earth playing pranks by making funny calls everywhere. How? Well, he kinda took control of a big satellite. Jimmy really tried to change him into a good guy, only Evil Jimmy messed up the machine that could turn him good. The guy didn't stop there and used this camera thing called the duplicator to make a copy of Earth. It was classically called the Evil Earth, and that copy started making the real Earth slowly disappear. But wait, Evil Jimmy made sure to keep himself and the real Jimmy out of this mess. He didn't want more Jimmys around, obviously. Soon, even he realized the hell he's created, so he zoomed off on his rocket to undo the mess. But when he got there, he made everything super evil using a special chip. The place became all dark and crazy, and even Jimmy's friends and parents turned evil. Jimmy had to face off with his evil counterpart and managed to fix everything. But boy oh boy, evil Jimmy got really mad about this. He broke the evil chip in half, trying to trap the real Jimmy with him on the cloned Earth. It was like a dark dimension or something. But luckily, Jimmy escaped, trapping evil Jimmy instead, who was obviously super mad and promised to come back someday. Regrettably, because DNA Productions closed its doors after Season 3, it's now in the hands of the fans to guess what became of him following the series' conclusion. The most probable scenario is that he remains caught in the dark matter dimension or met his demise, although there's an incredibly slim possibility that he managed to break free and cause chaos wherever he went. But have you ever wondered how Jimmy whips out all this crazy stuff and nobody bats an eye? Well, fans speculate that Jimmy, Carl, Sheen, Cindy, and Libby aren't your regular kids. They're supposedly these genetically engineered youngsters. They were given some kind of special abilities and then plopped into fake families to nurture these powers. And here's the kicker. The rest of the town? Yeah, they're supposedly government-backed actors, which would explain why nobody ever seems too surprised when a kid cruises to school in a literal gumball bouncy ball. Now, you might be scratching your head wondering why anyone would cook up such a wild idea. Well, the theory tries to smooth that over by saying it's all because this city is like a guinea pig playground for the US government. You know all those crazy contraptions Jimmy comes up with? Like those pans that fold themselves? They make a one-time cameo and then poof, gone. Apparently the government's swiping his inventions to dissect and upgrade. Retroville is basically the secret laboratory for Jimmy's gizmos, and all those adventures the gang has, they're just a front for testing out his creations on the down low. There's a ton of stuff that seems to back up this idea, like when the gang took an impromptu trip to Egypt during class and accidentally stirred up some mummies. But here's the twist, they only went there because their teacher played a movie about it. That sounds pretty fishy, doesn't it? Almost like it's part of some master plan by the government. Then, you've got this super hush-hush military base, Area 86. Its mere existence supposedly supports the notion. Basically, we're talking about one massive web of deception here. Honestly, this actually kind of adds up. Plus, this theory got a dose of reality when the creator of the show, John A. Davis, weighed in. He affirmed it by saying that it was an interesting theory and also reminded that the company behind Jimmy is actually called DNA Productions. Now that's a heavy hint. But what's a series without some lovey-dovey stuff, right? However, in Jimmy Neutron, the relationship between him and Cindy wasn't something from the get-go. It was more of an evolution from enemies to lovers. So, in the whole show, Cindy and Jimmy are constantly at each other's throats, bickering like crazy and seeing themselves as total rivals. But over time, something changes and they start kind of liking each other, even though it's a bit of a love-hate situation. It's kind of tricky to figure out who's driving the ship here, but from what we can tell, Cindy's the one throwing these little hints of interest and Jimmy's all ears, picking up on those signs of affection real quick. Also, Cindy's always there, calling Jimmy out on his moves, trying to school him about the mess his plans and gadgets might cause. But dude just goes ahead and does his thing, not caring much about the warnings. Oh, and you can tell Cindy's not really into seeing Jimmy all down in the dumps or feeling blue. She's all about giving him a pat on the back, being the cheerleader. You can totally see it when Cindy had these moments where jealousy was waving a flag, Like when they got stuck in Egypt, Jimmy played the hero and gave Cindy a piggyback ride. They traded these grins and you could practically feel something in the air. And then there was this time when Jimmy held Libby's hand and she went all red in the face and bam, Cindy was all totally jealous. At the end of that adventure, Cindy dropped hints like telling Jimmy that she had a blast in Egypt and even gave him this playful hit on the shoulder. And man, both of them were blushing and just grinning like fools until Cindy's mood kind of flips and she goes right back to nagging Jimmy. It's like that moment when you're sharing a pizza and someone takes the last slice. Total mixed emotions. But come season 3, things start shifting a bit. They're finally getting real with their emotions and, letting go of that whole rivalry deal. Cindy's laying off the teasing towards Jimmy and his pals, and Jimmy's totally picking up on the vibe. He's even trying to show her that he's feeling the same way. They're slowly dropping the act of hiding their feelings from each other and just vibing when they're hanging solo. By the time the season wraps up, they've straight up admitted they're into each other and have even started dating. But here's the kicker. They're keeping it on the low, so when they're around others, they pretend to bicker like before. Cindy was putting herself out there trying to get Jimmy's attention, but there were times when he was totally in his own world and ignored her. And yeah, she didn't hold back when she was upset about it. Sometimes she even pointed fingers at him for stuff or tossed out some lame excuses. If the show had kept going, Jimmy and Cindy would have probably realized that pretending to be all mad at each other was totally pointless. They would have put that rivalry to rest for good. And yep, there was this epic moment where Jimmy finally leaned in and kissed Cindy. But Jimmy has far more important relationships than just Cindy like his pals Carl and Sheen. Unlike Cindy, these guys have been Jimmy's rock and soul throughout the whole series. Strangely enough, just like Jimmy's obsessed with his science stuff, his friends have their own dumber versions of obsession. Like Carl Weezer is totally llama obsessed and Sheen Estevez is ultra lord obsessed. Out of the two Sheens, the one who's extremely hyperactive and impulsive, I would also say borderline careless, but that's one thing he desperately fears and that's maths. Well, I can relate. Sheen was in a tight spot, facing the possibility of flunking a crucial maths test and repeating a whole year of school. So, Jimmy and Carl jumped in to help him hit the books, but Jimmy gave up pretty fast, thinking Sheen was a lost cause. But here's where it gets interesting. Jimmy decided to use his brain power to invent a solution that would help Sheen pass the test without all the studying. He came up with this gadget that was supposed to boost your smarts for a few hours. Sounded like a solid plan, right? Only things took a wild turn. Sheen went from smart to crazy smart in a flash, like off-the-charts intelligence, and suddenly he gained these mind-boggling telekinetic powers. Yup, things go from 0 to 60 real quick. On top of that, when Jimmy tried to talk to Sheen and get him back to his usual self, Sheen went and unlocked this crazy talent for making energy balls, messing with the weather, turning roads into quicksand, you name it. And if that wasn't enough, he even got the knack for reading minds. Despite all the chaos, Sheen decides to willingly slap on Jimmy's brain drain helmet to dial down his newfound superpowers. But let me tell you, those powers of his were seriously out of this world, like top tier strength in the entire show's history. If Sheen had been like, nah, no helmet for me, Jimmy probably wouldn't have been able to rein him in. Seriously, Jimmy had cooked up something so darn potent that it might have let Sheen take charge of the whole world, basically transforming him into a legit deity. That Smarty Pants gadget Jimmy used on Sheen, well, imagine it teamed up with Jimmy's electrolyte thing, which could revive folks and add a splash of immortality. And then you've got Carl, who's like super tone deaf and, well, kinda quirky, if you know what I mean. He's definitely not the smoothest guy around, and he's got a bunch of quirks like allergies, a llama obsession, and a knack for hurting his shoulders all the time. So you can guess he's not exactly a hit with the ladies. Even though he's not exactly a superstar, Carl still has this thing for girls. Problem is, his crushes usually don't stick around for more than one episode. But there's one character who's been a constant target for Carl's affections, Jimmy's mom. Yeah, you heard that right. In a very strange turn of events, Carl really wanted Judy to like him back, so he went a bit overboard. Under the effect of this strong-smelling thing called pheromones, he even dressed up like an Italian street performer with a musical thing. And guess what? He did all of this while Jimmy's parents were out for a Valentine's Day date. But wait, it gets even weirder. Carl sent a monkey to bother Hugh, and the monkey pulled Hugh into some bushes and made a mess, and all the while, Carl was talking to Judy and trying to come up with plans to get rid of Hugh so just he and Judy could be together forever. Like, seriously. Normally, Carl is this shy and cute but kinda clumsy guy, but when it's about Judy, he seems ready to do anything to make Hugh go away. You could say Carl's feelings for Jimmy's mom are way more serious than just a simple kid's crush. Someone keep an eye on this dude. But even though the show is all about having a blast, there's this kinda eerie and unsettling vibe that sneaks in beneath the surface. You've got your aliens, mutant beasts, and wicked smart villains, but there's also this collection of everyday weird stuff that stands out when you're looking at it as a grown-up. Like when the show dropped hints about some real-world dark stuff and threw in several instances where mass media was used to manipulate the masses. Like, seriously, to create this sort of forced happy but messed up world. First off, there was this scene when Sheen came up to Jimmy and Carl telling them to catch this new TV show called The Happy Show. But here's the kicker. Sheen was acting super weird, all hyper happy and totally zen. It didn't take long to figure out that the whole darn town was being hypnotized into this mega happiness and were practically forcing everyone else to watch that show. Before you know it, everyone had tuned in and was trying their best to get Jimmy on board too. The mastermind behind the whole thing turned out to be none other than the show's star, Grandma Taters, who seemed to have this big plan to spread happiness across the world. So Jimmy and Cindy teamed up and managed to break the mind control grip. But here's where things get interesting. The idea of people in Retroville getting all stirred up because of what they saw on TV came back around in another episode titled Lady Sings the News. Not only did it sound a warning about how television could seriously twist someone's perspective on life, but that episode even delved into the whole concept of pursuing happiness. Instead of faking like everything was hunky-dory and turning society into some kind of odd version of We Happy Few, they made it clear that it was perfectly normal to express emotions like anger and sadness outwardly. That's some lesson in there. And then there's this episode where everyone is literally so chill with a literal ongoing epidemic. The whole thing kicked off when Jimmy was trying out one of his inventions, the sick patch. When you put it on, you'd instantly get sick. And Jimmy, being the smart cookie he is, figured out how to trick his parents into believing he was actually sick so he could skip school. Naturally, all the other kids in Retroville wanted in on this action too, and the sick patches became super popular. At first, skipping school felt like a total win for the students, but then things got all wonky. The sick patches started to disappear into everyone's skin, and before you know it, all the kids in Retroville were genuinely sick, and there was no way to undo the whole thing. Apart from the wild journey into Carl's body to find a cure, the weirdest thing about the episode is how the parents react when their kids get sick. Instead of taking them to a doctor, it's like every grown-up goes for some strange home remedies instead of regular medicine. Like Cindy's mom gives her acupuncture, Libby's mom stings her with a bee, Sheen's dad shoves pepper up his nose, and the most bizarre might be Carl's dad, who sticks Carl in a plastic bubble. Considering how much of this alternative stuff is going on, you'd wonder if Retroville even has any doctors around. It's pretty unexpected for a show that's all about a super smart kid who loves science to have so many odd ideas about medicine. But I guess this just feeds more towards the evidence that Retroville is just a testing ground. However, it's in Season 3 that the strangest cosmic-related episode takes place. I'd say prepare yourself to grimace. When Jimmy, Sheen, and Carl traveled to planet Shmenji, they were trying to get a sample of this odd material that was stuck to a cave wall. Carl thought he'd be all cool and used a knife on what looked like an alien egg pod, but then boom, the thing suddenly opened up and this gray crabby creature attached itself to Carl's mouth. Disgusting! Of course, they rushed back to Jimmy's lab in a panic, but it was too late, and it turns out the alien creature totally decided to use Carl's body as, like, its own incubator. This super freaky thing becomes obvious to everyone in Retroville when Carl's pregnancy starts getting, visible. And get this, it's all happening on his butt. Like, seriously, Carl's butt just keeps getting bigger and bigger and glowing purple. Plus, he starts having these totally weird cravings and mood swings. It's like, whoa, what's going on? The whole situation kind of messes with that whole idea of aliens snatching people and poking around in, like, uncomfortable places. And here's the crazy part. Even though Carl is, like, a kid and all, the town is, like, throwing a party for the upcoming birth of his alien thing instead of being totally freaked out. So, like, the whole episode feels kind of surreal. But you know what? The happy ending makes sure things stay fresh and, not too heavy for the audience. Still, gotta admit, Carl's whole pregnancy deal is definitely one of the most awkward moments in the whole world of Jimmy Neutron. Nevertheless, the show often tosses in some spacey stuff too. Like, you've got Jimmy's inventions throwing the whole cosmic balance out of whack and dropping hints about life from other planets. Oh, and speaking of weirdness, let's talk about Bolby Straganovsky, the foreign exchange student in Retroville. He's supposedly from this made-up place called Bakharistan, not any real place, and basically a mix of all sorts of Eastern European stereotypes. Bolby's friends in school find him and his ways kinda strange and sometimes even a bit bothersome, which might feel a bit awkward to watch. When Bolby accidentally joined Jimmy and the gang on this crazy adventure where they're part of this space game show that decides Earth's fate, Bolby is strangely seen as this unknown species. So is this guy even human? However, the season finale is perhaps the best cosmic episode of them all. where literally all of the show's villains come together to defeat the big-headed Neutron. Well, what happens is that King Goobot, one of the original nemesis, shoots out invites to a bunch of folks who've given Jimmy a hard time before, all to team up and take him down. There were folks like Professor Calamitous, Beautiful Gorgeous, the Junkman, Baby Eddie, Eustace Stritch, Grandma Taters, Zix, Travoltron, and T. Well, they spent most of their time arguing with each other while Jimmy was showing his upgraded gadget to his friends. But guess what? The villain squad swooped in, messed with Jimmy's robot pal Goddard, locked his lab, and made his friends dance like crazy with some wild music. And yup, they grabbed Jimmy without a hitch. Only Sheen somehow snuck onto their spaceship. Meanwhile, these bad guys held this totally unfair trial and called Jimmy guilty, and that's when Sheen tried to save the day in a not-so-smooth way. It totally didn't go as planned, and yup, Jimmy and Sheen found themselves stuck in a cell, while the bad guys started going back and forth, arguing about how to kick Jimmy out for good. In the end, Eddie suggested simply blasting Jimmy and Sheen into deep space, and they all agreed to that horror. This is where Sheen starts befriending one of the villains, T, despite Jimmy warning him, but turns out Sheen's gut feeling was spot on because T ends up being pretty cool. He even lets Sheen borrow this gadget and helps Jimmy get in touch with Carl, giving him the lockdown about the kidnapping and what needs to go down next. Well, in the end, Zix, Travoltron, and T bid the bad club adieu and switched over to Jimmy's side. Meanwhile, others got stuck back in the time of dinosaurs, chilling with T-Rex and caught in the prehistoric party. And that's how they officially bit the dust.